Harold Howard. At UFC 3 in 1994, Canadian karate stylist Harold Howard advances to the final after Royce Gracie withdraws due to exhaustion, creating one of the tournament's strangest brackets. Facing alternate Steve Jenham, Howard is submitted by guillotine choke just 1 minute and 27 seconds into the fight, a loss that cements Jenham's unlikely championship. Howard becomes memorable less for his wins than for his brash post-fight statement, "If you're coming on, come on," a line that fans still recall decades later. His career with the promotion ends 2 years later at UFC 7 in Buffalo, where he attacks his opponent's corner following a stoppage, an act that prompts the UFC to ban him outright. The organization had no tolerance for fighters who endangered staff or violated post-bout decorum. Howard is never rebooked despite the promotion's limited roster in the mid-1990s. The decision underscores UFC's growing insistence on regulating fighter behavior, paving the way towards stricter enforcement in the Joe Sun case at UFC 4. Joe Sun. At UFC 4 in December 1994, heavyweight Joe Sun makes his debut against Keith Hackney, losing by submission in 2 minutes after absorbing a series of unanswered punches. The bout becomes infamous because Hackney lands repeated groin strikes, an act technically legal under the rules at the time, exposing major regulatory gaps in the sport's early framework. Sun never fights in the UFC again, his limited performance and notoriety ensuring the promotion distances itself quickly. Years later, his name resurfaces when he is convicted of violent crimes, receiving a life sentence in California in 2011. The UFC responds by scrubbing his record from promotional materials and quietly blacklisting him from any association with the brand. Because the company seeks mainstream legitimacy under athletic commissions, fighters with criminal convictions are treated as liabilities. Gerald Gordeau, the Dutch savage striker who reached the final of UFC 1 in 1993, is remembered less for his skill than for his repeated violations of sportsmanship. After biting Royce Gracie's ear in the Denver tournament, he is never booked again by the promotion, a quiet but permanent ban that establishes early disciplinary precedent. His reputation worsens in Japan when he eye-gouges Shudo lightweight Yuki Nakai in 1995, leaving Nakai partially blind but still fighting through the event. Gordeau develops a reputation for refusing gloves, skipping handshakes, and dismissing traditional signs of respect, further alienating promoters. In the Zuffa era, when UFC sought mainstream acceptance, Gordeau's name became absent from official history. Because public image and regulatory legitimacy matter, fighters who flaunt disrespect are treated as liabilities regardless of record. The next wave of exclusions would follow not from fouls in the cage, but from political backlash against UFC's unsanctioned events in Puerto Rico. Tank Abbott. David Tank Abbott explodes onto the scene at UFC 6 in July 1995, marketed as a street fighter with raw knockout power, and he quickly validates the label with 2 brutal stoppages on the same night. His heavy hands and aggressive brawling style attract attention, but his volatility outside the cage soon creates problems for the promotion. At UFC 11 in 1996, Abbott is involved in a post-fight melee and is physically removed from the area, leading to immediate suspension. Over the following years, he receives multiple warnings and disciplinary actions as UFC officials struggle to balance his drawing power against his erratic behavior. Dana White later describes him as uncontrollable, a liability at a time when athletic commissions are already skeptical of mixed martial arts. Abbott's charisma makes him a fan favorite, but his record of 10 UFC wins is overshadowed by controversies that keep regulators wary. When Zuffa purchases the UFC in 2001, Abbott is not re-signed, effectively ending his run with the organization and marking his quiet blacklisting. Gilbert Yvel. Dutch heavyweight Gilbert Yvel earns notoriety long before entering the UFC, most infamously in 2004 when he kicks a referee during a European event, leading to worldwide condemnation. His career already includes incidents of biting, eye gouging, and illegal strikes, creating a disciplinary record that commissions find impossible to overlook. Because of this history, the Nevada State Athletic Commission refuses to grant him a license until 2007, effectively stalling any opportunity to compete in the United States. When UFC finally signs him in 2010, He competes 3 times, including a loss to Junior Dos Santos at UFC 108, but the stigma of his past makes regulators and fans skeptical of his presence. After dropping another bout at UFC 115 in Vancouver, Ivel is quietly released and never rebooked, closing his short run in the organization. For a fighter with 38 career wins and 31 finishes, the issue is never performance, but trustworthiness in sanctioned competition. His removal shows that reputation can be as damaging as results. Josh Barnett. In March 2002 at UFC 36 in Las Vegas, Josh Barnett defeats Randy Couture by TKO, becoming the youngest heavyweight champion in UFC history at just 24 years old. That accomplishment collapses within days when the Nevada State Athletic Commission announces he has failed a post-fight drug test for anabolic steroids, immediately stripping him of the title and suspending him from competition. Because the UFC is already under pressure to demonstrate legitimacy, the promotion quietly distances itself from Barnett, who does not return for more than a decade. During his absence, he builds a career in Pride, Pancrase, and Strikeforce, but his relationship with UFC leadership remains fractured. Barnett always denied intentional use, but the failed test defined his public image during the sport's push for regulation. When he finally re-signs with the organization, his comeback arrives at UFC 164 in 2013, where he stops Frank Mir in the first round. His return marks the end of an 8-year blacklist and leads directly into another long-running disciplinary saga, that of Nick Diaz and his repeated drug test failures. Nick Diaz, the Stockton-born welterweight with elite boxing volume and jiu-jitsu credentials, makes his UFC debut at UFC 47 in 2004, knocking out Robbie Lawler in the second round. His career gains momentum with high-profile wins, but controversy follows when he defeats Takanori Gomi in a 2007 Pride UFC crossover bout, only to fail a post-fight drug test for marijuana. The pattern continues in 2012 after his interim title fight against Carlos Condit at UFC 143, where another positive test leads to a year-long suspension. His most severe punishment comes in 2015 after facing Anderson Silva at UFC 183. When the Nevada Commission issues a 5-year ban and a $165,000 fine for marijuana metabolites, penalties widely condemned as excessive. The backlash from fighters, media, and fans forces the commission to reduce his suspension, highlighting inconsistencies in enforcement during the USADA era. Diaz is eventually reinstated, but the years lost to regulatory battles define much of his prime. His turbulent record of brilliance and blacklisting sets the stage for Paul Daley's career-ending expulsion after a single punch thrown at the wrong time. Paul Daley, at UFC 113 in Montreal on May 8, 2010. British welterweight Paul Daley enters the co-main event against Josh Koscheck with a 23-8 record and heavy knockout power. After losing a unanimous decision that secures Koscheck a title shot, Daley infamously throws a sucker punch after the final bell, an act broadcast live to millions and condemned immediately by officials. Dana White announces within hours that Daley will never fight in the UFC again, enforcing a lifetime ban despite Daley's public apology and admission of frustration. The decision is significant because Daley remains a marketable name, yet UFC prioritizes its disciplinary stance to protect legitimacy under athletic commissions. The organization had tolerated controversial figures before, but post-fight violence against opponents set a line that could not be crossed. Daley continues his career in Strikeforce, Bellator, and international promotions, adding dozens of fights but never returning to the octagon. His permanent blacklist highlights UFC's uncompromising position, paving the way for Renato Sobral's ejection after a similarly dangerous refusal to release a choke in 2007. Renato Babalu Sobral. At UFC 74 in Las Vegas on August 25, 2007, Brazilian light heavyweight Renato Babalu Sobral enters with a 28-6 record and the experience of 2 UFC title challenges. Facing David Heath, he secures an anaconda choke late in the second round, but after Heath taps visibly, Sobral refuses to release the submission for several extra seconds, forcing referee Steve Mazzagatti to intervene physically. The act is broadcast live, and the crowd reacts negatively as Heath lies dazed on the canvas. Sobral later admits in a post-fight interview that he held the choke intentionally to teach respect, a statement that seals his fate. Dana White responds immediately, declaring, "You don't do that here," and UFC releases Sobral the same night despite his victory. The refusal to protect a tapped opponent is treated as endangerment rather than gamesmanship. Sobral is blacklisted from the promotion permanently, and his removal clears space for the next enforcement case. Rousimar Palhares, whose career also unravels because of repeated submission, holds release too late. Rousimar Palhares, the Brazilian middleweight later moved to welterweight, debuts at UFC 111 in March 2010, and quickly earns a reputation as one of the sport's most dangerous heel hook specialists. His grappling pedigree brings finishes, but controversy follows because he repeatedly holds submissions after opponents tap, a violation treated with exceptional seriousness under Athletic Commission rules. At UFC 111, he is suspended for not immediately releasing a leg lock on Thomas Drawl, drawing criticism from referees and fighters alike. The final incident occurs at UFC Fight Night 29 in October 2013, when he submits Mike Pierce with a heel hook but continues applying pressure after the tap and referee intervention. UFC responds within 24 hours, announcing his immediate release for endangering opponents' safety, and commissions support the decision by withholding bonuses and suspending his license. Palhares' reputation as a submission finisher becomes inseparable from the perception that he cannot be trusted to stop when required. His expulsion illustrates how fighter conduct during submissions is policed as tightly as strikes, setting the stage for Anthony Johnson's removal from the roster due to repeated weight-cutting controversies. Anthony "Rumble" Johnson. At UFC 142 in Rio de Janeiro on January 14, 2012, Anthony "Rumble" Johnson arrives for a scheduled middleweight bout against Vitor Belfort, but misses the 186-pound limit by an astonishing 11 pounds. The failed cut forces the fight to be contested at a catchweight, and Dana White reacts with immediate frustration, declaring that Johnson will be cut from the roster regardless of outcome. This decision effectively blacklists him despite his record of 12 UFC wins, including 6 knockouts, and his reputation as one of the heaviest hitters in the division. Johnson spends the next 2 years rebuilding his career in regional promotions and World Series of Fighting, competing at light heavyweight and even heavyweight, proving he can thrive without severe cuts. He returns to UFC in 2014 at 205 pounds, where he scores notable knockouts over Antonio Rogério Nogueira, Alexander Gustafsson, and Glover Teixeira, eventually challenging for the title twice. His legacy is complicated by outside troubles and recurring questions about professionalism, but his knockout power remains undeniable. Johnson's reinstatement demonstrates that extraordinary talent can earn a second chance. Wanderlei Silva, the Brazilian middleweight legend with 27 knockout victories and a decade-long run in Pride, transitions to the UFC in 2007, immediately headlining against Chuck Liddell. By 2014, however, his career unravels when the Nevada State Athletic Commission orders a random drug test before UFC 175. Silva flees his gym rather than provide a sample. The NSAC responds by issuing a lifetime ban, later reduced to a 3-year suspension after legal appeals, but the damage to his UFC standing is irreversible. Dana White freezes Silva out of competition until 2022, refusing to book him even after his suspension expires. Silva claims mistreatment and bias, but his relationship with UFC management collapses beyond repair. Although his ban is eventually softened, his absence from the octagon during his later years underscores how regulatory and promotional politics can end elite careers. The next case highlights another veteran, Mark Hunt, whose legal battles against UFC create a blacklist rooted not in drug testing, but in lawsuits over fighter safety. Mark Hunt, the New Zealand heavyweight and former K1 Grand Prix champion with renowned knockout power, debuts at UFC 127 in Sydney in February 2011, losing by submission to Sean McCorkle. He rebounds with a string of highlight reel knockouts, including finishes of Czech Congo and Roy Nelson, cementing his status as a fan favorite despite late entry into MMA. The turning point arrives at UFC 200 in July 2016 when Hunt loses to Brock Lesnar, only for Lesnar to test positive for banned substances after the fight. Hunt responds by filing a lawsuit against UFC and Zuffa, alleging that the organization knowingly allowed a compromised opponent, raising issues of fighter safety and contractual responsibility. By 2019, Hunt publicly states he has been blacklisted, with UFC refusing to offer him further fights while litigation continues. His case highlights the tension between athlete safety, promotional power, and the business model of high-revenue attractions. The fallout ensures Hunt's UFC career ends in court rather than in the cage. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks for watching.